Today, we're going to talk about the 7 things you need to know about construction injuries. There's construction happening all the time, all over the place, and most of the time people think that's a good thing. Unfortunately, in my line of work, I see the bad side. That means people are getting hurt at work, and I think it's an important topic, and I think people really need to know the main things to expect when you're injured at work. And the first thing is to seek medical attention. Oftentimes, people brush their symptoms under the rug. They try and finish out the workday or the project. They want to earn a paycheck and they don't want to be out of work, and so they're afraid to seek medical attention. And quite frankly, that can only make things worse. And also, if your injury is disputed, that can also impact your credibility, because oftentimes people don't seek care immediately. The insurance carrier is more likely to deny liability for the case because there's a gap in between when you were supposedly hurt and when you first sought treatment. That can also affect the doctor's opinion regarding your case as well. The second thing you should be aware of is notifying your supervisor. Ultimately, this means your foreman, or ultimately the owner of the company, or the HR department if it's a big enough corporation to have one. You want to make sure that your injury was reported, and more importantly, you want to document who it was reported to and when you reported it. I can't tell you how many times I've seen people say that they've talked to a supervisor, they've been told to go back to work, they didn't take notes, they didn't even know who the supervisor was if it was their first day on the job. And then later down the road, when we're at trial and we're trying to explain that the injury was reported, we really didn't have any proof of it. And so it makes the case more difficult. So it's always best to take notes, make sure you document who and when you reported the injury to, and if possible, put it in writing, whether it's email or a text message, something that shows that you actually reported the injury. If you can only report it to a coworker because of the nature of the injury or the circumstance you're in, for example, if you're being driven to the hospital by a coworker and you didn't get the time to talk to your supervisor, that's okay too. Just make sure you're in a position where you're with someone, either a witness or you've documented it in some other way so we know that it's there. That way, if there's a dispute later on, it's easy to bring up in a case. The third thing you should do is gather witness accounts. And this means if you're injured on the job, make sure if there's other people around, you remember who those people are. Sometimes you're in a position where you can't document that. For example, I've had cases where people have been ejected from vehicles or they've amputated their arm or a leg with a tool. And they're not going to sit there with a notebook and document things. And it's pretty obvious. And in those circumstances, it's okay. But to the extent you do have an injury that hasn't affected your mental state and you're still capable of documenting who's there, you should always take notes and make sure you get names if possible. The third thing you should do, or fourth thing you should do, if your case is disputed especially, is hire a lawyer. Oftentimes people think they can navigate the system on their own, and it's very difficult. Quite frankly, there's lawyers that I've worked with on the defense side who've been practicing for 30 plus years and they still don't know what they're doing. And so it's not an easy system. It's even more difficult when you're on your own and injured, especially if it's your first time around. Workers' comp is extremely complicated, and it's much easier for us as lawyers to work things up on the front side of a case rather than trying to put Humpty Dumpty back together on the back end. So again, if you have any question about workers' comp, your case is denied, or you're not comfortable going through the process, I would highly recommend getting a lawyer right away. The fifth thing you should do is filing a claim form. In California, we use something called the DWC-1 claim form, which is an official state form that's used to actually report a case. It's partly filled out by you and partly filled out by your employer. If you tell your employer you're injured, they should give you one right away. If they don't give you one, you can always download one. Just Google search DWC-1 and it should pop up. You can print it out. The top portion is for you to fill out, and it's extremely important that you fill it out in detail. For example, documenting how the injury occurred, when it occurred, your basic information like your name and such, as well as the body parts that are impacted. And I can't tell you how many times I see that someone doesn't add in body parts in the beginning and they try and add it in later, and it causes problems because if you didn't report it at the beginning, the assumption is that it's made up because it didn't happen until a later date. Again, that kind of goes back to not seeking treatment right away. You want to make sure the squeaky wheel gets the grease. And that really means that everything's addressed right away. So if you feel like you have a symptom in your shoulder and your hand, make sure you write down that it's your shoulder and your hand, not just the one that's hurting you most, which people tend to do. So again, more details, the better. And once that's done, make sure you give it to your employer. And more importantly, make sure you keep a copy of it and make sure you document who you actually gave to the form to and when you did. If possible, again, delivering that via picture and a text message to your supervisor and or actually emailing it is always best because you have documentation supporting when and who you gave it to. The next sixth thing is very important. Oftentimes, there's multiple people at construction sites, whether it's other subcontractors, general contractors and such, or sometimes it's just your own company being sloppy and not following OSHA guidelines. OSHA does have what are called standing safety orders in California, which are mandated rules which dictates how companies should operate in a safe way to prevent injuries. We know there's a lot of companies out there that like to cut costs. They like to expedite the construction process in order to please customers and save on their own time on the back end. And oftentimes this means cutting corners in unsafe ways. Sometimes it's not necessarily the company, but other coworkers or people who are in supervisory roles that are really kind of stepping outside of their bounds and kind of putting the new guys or the unfamiliar guys in a position where they're likely to get hurt because they feel like they're pressured to do things in a sketchy way. And so ultimately, if you feel like your injury was caused by the negligence of the employer, you always want to report the claim to OSHA. And OSHA will actually come out and conduct an investigation. If they find that the employer did something wrong, they will actually cite the employer for it. And sometimes the penalties can be massive. And this is important because it dissuades future misconduct on the part of the employer by cutting corners and taking measures that aren't safe for you as an injured worker and an employee at that company. And so again, you should always report this if you feel like there's wrongdoing in play. If you report an injury, it is anonymous. So that means the employer won't have record of you actually reporting the injury. And they're actually required themselves to report injuries that happen that are serious and involve lost time. So quite frankly, if your employer hasn't done it, you really need to step up and do it. That way you're making sure that they're investigated and that you're protected and that other people at the company are also protected in the future to ensure that if injuries happen again and it's due to continued negligence, the employer will be held accountable for it. The last thing you need to know is that don't worry if you get a denial. Ultimately, you can appeal denials at the WCAB, and that is really best done by a lawyer. So if you get a denial in the mail or you get a delay in the mail indicating that the insurance company may be contesting liability, contact a lawyer right away. It's not something you want to deal with it your own, but I want to say this just because I want you to know that don't feel defeated if you do get a denial or you do get a delay. There's still opportunity to turn things around for you and make sure your case is picked up. So if you have any questions, feel free to check us out. Again, these are the 7 things you need to know about construction injuries, but workers' comp is a very, very, very confusing, big process. So I'm sure there's a lot of stuff I didn't cover. And if you do have questions, feel free to check us out.